Welcome to Let's Talk Micro. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Micro. I hope you had a great week. If you celebrate Thanksgiving, I hope you had a good one. If not, at the very least, you had some good time with family, friends. Like I mentioned before, it's good to spend time with family, especially in these challenging times when, due to COVID, we have been in our homes, a lot of times, alone. It definitely has been challenging for our children with school and staying at home. So I hope that at least you had some good times. Before we get started, remember that Let's Talk Micro, it's available on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, Overcast, Pandora. Wherever you listen to your podcast, you can find Let's Talk Micro. I am also on Instagram as Let's Talk Micro, no apostrophe, and on Twitter as Let's Talk Micro 1. If you have any questions, any episode suggestions, I also have an email address, which is Let's Talk Micro, no apostrophe, at outlook.com. So please feel free to email any suggestions that you might have. And follow me on social media. I definitely like to post pictures of organisms. Not a lot of information because I reserve that for the podcast. But at the very least, nice visuals of different bacteria. So it's really nice. So go ahead and follow. And also any suggestions through social media, please feel free. So we had a really good episode. The last episode was really good, right? You've been hearing about the MALDI-TOF here, MALDI-TOF again. So we finally talked, and I like to say we, but it's myself. I finally talked about MALDI-TOF. And today, that's what we're going to continue doing. I will continue. I talk about the spectra, and I will talk more about that. So if you didn't listen to the last episode, please go ahead and do so. But I'm going to give you a quick summary. So what is MALDI-TOF? So MALDI-TOF, like I mentioned before, it stands for Matrix Assisted Laser Desorption Ionization Time of Flight Mass Spectrometry. So this technique, you're going to use a laser and you excite the chemical functional groups that are included in the proteins of an organism. And that's how it works. You're going to apply your sample. You're going to apply a matrix, which when you point the laser, absorbs heat and is going to transfer it to the sample, ionizing it. And then these ions, they are separated on a tube, which is referred to as the flight tube. And then you measure these ions with a detector. The lighter the ions, the faster they will travel in the tube. So with this, a spectrum is created as a mass spectrum. So this is a type of mass spec using a mass to charge ratio. And then once you have this spectrum, you're going to compare it to known spectra of bacteria and fungi that's already stored in a database. And that's how you obtain an identification. I mentioned two systems that are used in clinical micro, which have the Bruker, which is the MALDI biotyper, and then bioMero, which, as you know, you're familiar with the Vitek. That's pretty popular in a lot of labs. bioMero has the Vitek MS, which is the one that I went over. So I talked about its components. It's a very simple setup. So you have a slide with 3 sections or acquisitions, and each section has 16 spots for samples and 1 for your calibrator. Your calibrator is a strain of QC of E. coli. You apply the calibrator the same way you will apply your samples. So using a 1 microliter loop, you grab your colony, you spread it on the circle, and then don't wait too long. The company says you don't want your colonies to dry, and then you apply the matrix, right? That's a very long name. If you want to hear it again, go ahead and listen to the previous episode. but it's abbreviated CHCA, or the Chica. So you apply that matrix by pipetting it, which is zero point 0.1 microliters. You let it dry, and then you load your slide. And like I mentioned, that matrix is gonna ionize your sample, which then those ions are gonna be measured. So that's how it works. The procedure for yeast, it's very similar, but however, before you add your matrix, you add formic acid, and it's provided by the company. You let that dry, and then you add your matrix. And that's what I was saying, that if you have a lot of samples, it's good practice to start with your yeast first. That way your formic acid starts drying. By the time you're done, you add your matrix. And then once everything is dry, you can load your slide. If you don't have that many samples, then it is recommended, talk to your coworkers if someone else is going in. Let them know via like a paper or communication that your sample still needs the matrix, and then they can do it for you. You don't want to be wasteful, because I mentioned that the acquisition, whether you load 16 samples or you do one, once you load that slide on the instrument, that acquisition, you cannot use it anymore. By not being wasteful, different techs are on the micro lab, because I mentioned this is an expensive instrument, so you probably have a very high volume lab, which that means that it's split in benches: wound bench, respiratory, urine. So another tech might have some samples. So if you have 2 or 3 samples to put on your slide, then someone else can come in and actually, add more. So that's one thing. It is not good to be wasteful. So I mentioned that a spectrum is produced, a mass spectrum, based on the mass to charge ratio, and it is compared to the database, right? So that's how you get that ID. If you put your sample, the spectrum, it's that of an E. coli that's stored in the database, then your ID comes back as an E. coli. I mentioned that it works most of the time. So what are the limitations of this? Well, there's a disclaimer that it does not distinguish between E. coli and Shigella. But I mean, that would indole colony morphology. That's a pretty easy fix. It also cannot differentiate between Achromobacher denitrificans and Psilocybins. As you know, sometimes when those of you that work with the Vitek, when you load a sample, right, sometimes it gives you something called a low discrimination, that it cannot make a determination whether it's one bacteria or the other, and it recommends some test to do, right? I think sometimes you have seen like that famous Aerococcus versus Granulicatella, and it puts like recommended test PYR. You have seen low discrimination between Proteus mirabilis and vulgaris, and recommends indole, Klebsiella pneumoniae, and Enterobacter aeruginosa, and recommends a urea test. So you see this, like it cannot make a determination, and it's giving you some options. So with the Achromobacher, it's always going to give you, and I'm talking about the Vitek MS. It's going to give you a low discrimination between Psilocybins and denitrificans. So in that point in time, you can go ahead and report your organism as Achromobacher species, and then perform an ID via another method, like let's say the Vitek, or I don't know if you have Microscan, depending on what your lab has. It also cannot differentiate between subspecies of Streptococcus dysgalactiae, right? So it will give you like 2 subspecies. But in this case, it is still a Streptococcus dysgalactiae, so that's perfectly fine to release. So you can go ahead and just release that one as is. Another limitation, let's say that it cannot differentiate between the members of the Burkholderia cepacia complex. So it can give you like low discrimination between Burkholderia multivorans, versus Burkholderia vietnamensis. At that point in time, I mean, that's gonna be what your facility says, but it's gonna, you can release that as a Burkholderia cepacia complex. You can also, the same thing happens with the Enterobacter cloacae complex. It gives you like, low discrimination between Enterobacter absuriae, Enterobacter hormaki, Enterobacter kobe. So in that case, you can just release it as Enterobacter cloacae complex. So it's just like this spectrum, it's just very, they're very similar. So it will give you a low discrimination between those choices. But I mean, it is a complex, so you can go ahead and release it as a complex. The most important thing is, like, for example, with the Achromovacter, in that case, you cannot say Achromovacter psilocybins complex or Denitrificans complex. So in that case, you will actually have to do another method of ID. But in the meantime, you can release it as Achromovacter species. So those are some of the limitations that it has that is going to low discriminate. I mentioned in the previous episode that also when your sample is very mucoid, it might fail. The ID doesn't give you an identification. The company recommends for you to, with a swab, remove some of that mucus, and then put your colony in. And I mentioned my method that I stick the loop and just wiggle a little bit, and that kind of just removes some of that mucus, and then I just load my slide. Another thing that is good with mucoid, maybe load 2 spots, which the instrument will give you an option to do. So instead of single spotting, which is the way that normally they will do it, you can do a double spotting. So you add a spot, add a colony on each, add matrix on each. For bacteria, if it's yeast, add a colony on each, formic acid on each, dry, and then matrix. It's also like the double spotting is good when you're working on your technique. So maybe if it's the first time that your lab has MALDI-TOF, might be a good idea to do double spotting until everyone gets their technique down, and then you reduce it to single spotting. But having said that, with the mucoid, it's always a good suggestion to do double spotting, since it can get finicky with mucoid samples. It's best, if one spot fails, then you get another one. But follow the recommendations about maybe doing the swap or removing some of that mucus. Or you can do my little trick about the wiggling, and it works. Another limitation that the instrument has, but this one is not, it's not a quick fix, but it's a long term, it can be fixed. It's like some organisms on the database, they show it an N, which is for like a non-validated organism. So that's easily fixed in the way that you can just validate the organisms by running them on another method. And then once you get to a certain number, it is okay to release that ID. The challenge might be that maybe you might not get that organism that often. So to get to the point where it is fully validated, it might take you some time. But that happens with like one of the easier ones was like a Erycoccus urinae that used to come with the N. You get that with the elderly in urine cultures. So that one might be easier to validate. Another thing with the organisms have the N, because this system, they connected with your LIS in your lab. So once you accept the ID, it will cross over to your LIS system. So you can accept it and report it. When you have organisms that have the N, they don't cross over. But if your laboratory has validated it, let's say you keep getting, you run that sample in the MALDI, you get that Erycoccus, 3-4 times, and then every time you set it up on the Vitek, then once you get to that number that your lab has established, then you can just type the ID, just document saying MALDI-TOF ID as, so, document it in your workup, and then you can release that ID. I mean, even though it might not cross over, it stays on the patient's file. So that's your proof if anything ever comes to question about where did ID come from. It is in the patient's file that you have. Those IDs just stay there. The same thing as susceptibilities. It's a MILA, which is the system that bioMérieux has that communicates. You can connect your virtual blood instrument, you can connect your Vitek. So they all talk to each other, and then it talks to your LIS system. So now that I mentioned the limitations, what are some pros and cons of this? Well, definitely getting a faster ID. Like I mentioned, you don't need it takes a few minutes depending on how many samples you have. It's definitely faster. I mean, even if you have a full slide with 48 samples, you can get it in an hour and change. I mean, depending on the time the instrument, it warms up, it spots each one with the laser, and then your IDs come across, provided that nothing goes wrong. It takes about an hour. So it's definitely a faster turnaround for IDs. Like I mentioned before, an ID on the Vitek can take 4 to 5 hours. And if you combine that with the fact that maybe there are no readers on the other shifts, that ID won't get released until the next day. That's definitely very helpful, and also it helps the physicians or the providers to know what kind of organisms they have. I mean, as you know, some organisms are more resistant than others. Most enterobacteriales, E. coli doesn't have any intrinsic resistance. I mean, then some of the others they do some, whereas like Pseudomonas, Stenotrophomonas definitely has a lot of intrinsic resistance. So it is good for the provider to have that information out there. So like I mentioned, it will definitely be out before the end of your shift, depending on how many samples you have. It also, besides being a very simple setup, I mean, Vitek is very simple as well. However, you don't need that much sample, right? So that's a very big pro. Depending on which colonies, and I like to compare because the Vitek, I'm familiar with it too, and I work with it. If you have a staph or one of those like E. coli, maybe you don't need as many colonies. When you have some of the smaller organisms, like your Strep viridans, your Strep anginosus, smaller colonies, you need more to make the McFarland suspension, right? Which is the standard of turbidity. On the Vitek, typically for like gram-negative and gram-positive, it's like a 0.5 to 0.63 McFarland standard. So you need a fair amount of colonies depending on the size. So with the MALDI-TOF, if you have 2 or 3 colonies that are good, you can go ahead and use that. I mean, the smaller one's a little more difficult, but you still don't need as many as you would need to make a McFarland suspension. So that's really helpful, and then you can produce that ID. Another pro is that some organisms you don't perform susceptibilities on, depending on the source. Like for example, on the urine bench, you don't do susceptibilities on, let's say, on yeast. So an ID is sufficient, and that's it. You don't do susceptibilities in the urine bench on Staphylococcus saprophyticus. So just by ID in it, you're done. So it saves you a day of work, and then you're done with that culture. Whereas before, let's say, Staph sapro, it has a very distinctive morphology, but if you're a fairly junior tech, you're getting started, you might not recognize the morphology. So in those days, let's say if you had the Vitek, you're like, okay, well, I have to set up a GPI, gram-positive ID card, and then set up a susceptibility card in the chance that I'm wrong and it is not a Staph saprophyticus. And then the next day you find out. And then if it's a Staph saprophyticus, then you don't release susceptibility, so you kind of wasted a card. So with the MALDI-TOF, you just, okay, put the colony there, matrix, dry. Oh, Staph saprophyticus, you're done. And then the yeast, Like I mentioned, the same. If you were gonna do an ID on the Vitek for a yeast, you will need a very heavy McFarland suspension, like a 1.8 to 2.2. So that means that if you're isolated, it's not pure, you don't have that many colonies, you will have to sub it out. Then the next day, set up the ID card, and then it takes 18 to 24 hours for that ID to be done on the Vitek. So then the next day you can release that ID. So that's a whole 2 days of work. Whereas with a few colonies, you set it up on your MALDI-TOF, right? Colony, formic acid, dry, matrix, dry, put it in, and you're done. The same is true for anaerobes. You typically don't do susceptibilities on anaerobes. Without the MALDI-TOF, you will have to first do a challenge on it, right? Find out which is an air tolerance test. Find out if it's a facultative anaerobe versus an obligate anaerobe. And then you need a very heavy suspension to perform an ID on the Vitek, or to perform one of those rapid ANA kits that will give you an ID within 4 hours. You will need a lot of growth. So then you sub it out, do your tolerance, then the next day maybe it's ready, and then you 4 hours for that rapid kit, or a whole day to get an ID. So that's another 2 days of work. Whereas you are working on the anaerobe bench, or you're working on your wound bench and you're opening your anaerobes. It looks like an anaerobe. Put it on the MALDI-TOF, 1 or 2 colonies, and you are done. So it definitely saves supplies and it saves time that you can use on other things, right? So those are some very, very big pluses. Another one is Enterococcus urinae on the elderly. You want to make sure you see it before. If there's no MALDI-TOF, you do a gram stain, you're like, okay, let me see, maybe it's clusters, maybe it's not. On indirect smears, sometimes you cannot appreciate the morphology. So you're like, okay, let me do a PYR, it's negative, okay, I still need to rule it out. I have to do an ID. Maybe I don't have enough, I have to sub it out. Then the next day I do my ID, and then the next day I find out. So 2 days of work right there. Whereas you see the colonies growing, everything matches. You do your gram stain, it's a gram-positive cocci, put it on the MALDI-TOF, and then you're done. So with all these, it definitely saves you time and supplies. And you're done. You put the information out there, the provider gets it, and then the patient is treated. Definitely a lot of big pluses. Now, having said all the wonderful stuff that the MALDI-TOF has, I also have to talk about the cons, right? So these are things that I have observed. I think sometimes, it promotes a little bit of laziness. Like I mentioned, with the pros, definitely a faster turnaround time. So that's what I was getting at, and then saving supplies and time. With these, like I mentioned, it does promote a little bit of laziness, in the sense that I don't want to offend anyone. I think I have seen it sometimes on the younger techs now, that sometimes the mentality is, why do all these biochemicals if I can get an ID? Well, that has a very simple answer. By doing your biochemicals and doing all that work, gram stain biochemicals, that's how you get familiar with the organisms, right? I always like to say to students and to other techs, by the time you set up something on an instrument, you should have a pretty good idea of what it is, to the point that you almost know, you're just confirming. Because things can happen, and I'll talk about it in a little bit. So it promotes that people don't want to do the test that we used to do before because they're going to get an answer. I have also heard sometimes, techs setting up both methods because they don't want to do a gram stain. Like setting a method for yeast, setting a method for bacteria. And that is definitely not okay. You don't go on fishing expeditions trying to find out what it is. We have our tools and we do our work properly. this is very serious work. So that's what it promotes. So at the same time, by promoting the little bit of laziness, then techs don't get familiar with the organisms and things can go wrong. Let's say if someone else is doing your MALDI-TOF for you, they might not know which colony you mean. Then they set it up. You get an ID, and at the same time, since you don't know what it is, you make a mistake by releasing that ID. What about if you went ahead and, without realizing, scanned the wrong patient ID? And then you get the wrong ID of the organism and you release it because you don't know. So you should always get familiar with these organisms, right? Still do your strep typing, do your PYRs, do your indole, your oxidase. Study these organisms so you know them. Anything goes wrong, you know that, wait a minute, this is not what I was expecting. If something goes wrong, you get the wrong ID, there's something that you were not expecting, and you're like, okay, you can backtrack yourself and say, well, I did this, so this shouldn't be the case. So that's what I have noticed that it promotes. But that needs to be addressed as a manager, the lab level, about making sure that the technologists, they know the organisms, they have a good grasp of what it is. I mean, that's why competencies get done and stuff. Just to assess that everyone is on the same page, we're following procedure, and then we're doing what we're supposed to. But having said that, definitely the benefits, they're really good. The patients doing things properly, releasing the proper IDs, the patients will benefit because they get that ID out there faster, and at the same time we are saving supplies, even though from what I'm reading the initial cost is higher, but eventually you do save money by doing faster turnaround time, many ramifications. Patient can get treated faster, they get better faster, perhaps the hospital stay is reduced, so it has a lot of good benefits. But having said that, as microbiologists, we need to make sure that we know what we're doing. Use our textbooks, use our references, use other texts that have been doing it longer. Get familiar with the biochemicals, with how the organism looks like typically. Of course, we have atypical presentations, but overall, most of the organisms, they're the same morphologies. So with repetition and time, gram stains and biochemicals, we definitely learn how they look, and that makes us better at our work. But that attitude about, I'm not going to do it because I'm going to find out the answer, many things can go wrong along the way, and that can potentially harm our patients, and that is unacceptable. And that, my dear audience, is the end of this episode. This concludes the talk about the MALDI-TOF. I hope you got a better understanding of it. I hope you learn more about it. I hope you enjoy listening about it. I sure enjoyed talking about it. Just remember, always use all the tools that you have for your job. Do the best job you can and bring that motivation, that passion for it. This is wonderful work and we help out the patients so much. So please, use all the resources you have. Now you have this podcast as a supplemental tool as well, so use it. Ask questions. So stay motivated, stay safe, and of course, continue talking micro. Until the next time, bye.